From COP23, the UN Climate Summit in Bonn, Germany, this is Democracy Now!
The
military has reassured us this is not a coup d'etat. As you know, the African Union is against any unconstitutional change of government.
Correction or coup d'etat? Zimbabwe's military arrests longtime President Robert Mugabe and seizes control in Harare, the capital, then exposing the corporate influence here at COP.
The EIB is funding climate chaos.
It's funding climate chaos.
The EIB is funding fossil fuels.
It's funding fossil fuels.
We'll talk about the banks and fossil fuel companies pushing their agenda behind the scenes here in Bonn. And researchers here are warning Pacific Islanders may be among the first people in the world who are forced to migrate as a clear result of climate change. We'll speak with Dina Ionesco, head of Migration, Environment and Climate Change at the International Organization for Migration. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Zimbabwe, longtime leader Robert Mugabe remains under house arrest and is reportedly refusing to resign as president after Zimbabwe's military seized the parliament, courts, government offices, and the main airport in the capital, Harare. Robert Mugabe has held power since Zimbabwe declared independence from the United Kingdom 37 years ago. The 93-year-old leader was working to hand over power to his wife, 52-year-old Grace Mugabe. On Wednesday, African Union Commission Chair Moussa Faki Mahamat called for a democratic resolution to the political crisis in Zimbabwe.
The military has reassured us this is not a coup d'etat. As you know, the African Union is against any unconstitutional change of government.
Ça, c'est un principe sur lequel nous insistons.
This is a very fundamental principle of the African Union, and we systematically condemn any regime change by arms, whether it be military or rebellion.
Back in the United States, 2 more women have come forward to accuse Alabama Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore of sexual misconduct or making sexual advances toward them when they were teenagers. This brings the total number of women to 9. One woman said, quote, "I've known for over 20 years he was a predator, that he preyed upon girls in the mall. It's common knowledge," she said. As Moore's approval ratings continue to fall, Republican Party leaders met Wednesday to discuss how to deal with the crisis and how to keep Republicans in control of the seat once held by now Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Politico reports Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has even discussed asking appointed Senator Luther Strange of Alabama to resign from his seat in order to trigger a new special election. In California, the death toll from Tuesday's mass shooting has risen to 5 after authorities found the wife of the gunman dead in her home. Authorities now believe the gunman, Kevin Neal, killed his wife before he went on a shooting rampage through the town of Rancho Tehama. In news from the Middle East, former Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri has reportedly accepted an invitation from French President Emmanuel Macron to leave Saudi Arabia and come to France. Last week, Hariri unexpectedly resigned as Lebanese Prime Minister while on a trip to Saudi Arabia. On Wednesday, Lebanon's President, Michel Aoun, accused Riyadh of holding Hariri captive. Saudi Arabia is continuing to block food and medicine from being delivered to Yemen, which is facing the world's worst humanitarian crisis after years of war. 7 million Yemenis face famine. The UN says some 900,000 people have been infected with cholera. On Tuesday, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut took to the floor of the Senate to criticize the U.S. for its support of the Saudi-led war in Yemen.
It is U.S. refueling planes flying in the sky around Yemen that restock the Saudi fighter jets with fuel, allowing them to drop more ordnance. It is U.S.-made and transferred ordnance that is carried on these planes and are dropped on civilian and infrastructure targets inside Yemen. The United States is part of this coalition. The bombing campaign that has caused the cholera outbreak could not happen without us.
In other news from Capitol Hill, the House has passed a $700 billion military budget, by far the largest military budget in the world. According to the National Priorities Project, U.S. military expenditures are roughly the size of the world's next 7 largest military budgets combined. Meanwhile, a new study has found the amount spent by the U.S. on wars since the September 11th attacks in 2001 will top more than $5.6 trillion by the end of the fiscal year. According to the Brown University-based Costs of War project, the average U.S. taxpayer has spent over $23,000 to pay for the U.S. wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Pakistan, and other countries. In news from Capitol Hill, 5 Democratic lawmakers have introduced new articles of impeachment against President Trump. Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee is spearheading the effort.
We believe that President Trump has violated the Constitution, and we've introduced 5 articles of impeachment. The first is obstruction of justice, which deals with Mr. Comey's firing. The second is a violation of the Constitution's Foreign Emolument Clause, which deals with monies he's taken from foreign powers without the consent of Congress. The third is a violation of the Domestic Emoluments Clause, which deals with monies he's made from the United States and his personal businesses beyond that of his salary, which is also forbidden by our Constitution. The fourth is undermining our federal judiciary, and the fifth is undermining freedom of the press.
In Washington, D.C., jury selection has begun in the first trial of the nearly 200 people arrested during President Trump's inauguration. Some of the defendants are facing up to 75 years in prison. The first trial involves 6 people, including 1 journalist, Alexi Wood, a freelance photojournalist and videographer based in San Antonio, Texas. The American Civil Liberties Union has warned the trials will have a chilling effect on future protesters who will be scared to use their First Amendment rights. The Senate has confirmed a former top coal executive to head the Mine Health and Safety Administration, known as MSHA. David Zedalzalo faced criticism from Democrats because of his former company, Rhino Resources, had a record of repeatedly violating mine safety laws. In 2011, the company was fined $44,000 after one of its miners was killed in West Virginia. In media news, the billionaire right-wing Koch brothers may soon become major stakeholders in Time and People magazines. The Kochs have reportedly offered to invest $500 million in Meredith Corporation, which is trying to buy the magazines. Meredith is the publisher of Family Circle and Better Homes and Gardens. In other media news, the lower chamber of Russia's parliament has approved legislation to require foreign journalists to register as foreign agents and declare details about their funding and finances. Amnesty International described the vote as a serious blow to press freedom in Russia. The vote comes shortly after the United States forced the international Russian broadcaster RT to register as foreign agents. The state of Ohio was forced to postpone the execution of a severely ill 69-year-old man after his executioners could not find a suitable vein to use for lethal injection. They tried to find one for 30 minutes. The prisoner, Alva Campbell, relies on a walker and wears a colostomy bag. His lawyers say he requires frequent breathing treatments and may have lung cancer. The state of Ohio attempted to carry out the execution even though doctors had failed to find veins in either of Campbell's arms suitable for inserting an IV during a recent exam. An undocumented human rights activist has taken sanctuary inside a New Orleans church in an attempt to avoid deportation back to El Salvador. Jose Torres is the father of 2 U.S.-born daughters, both of whom are chronically ill. Torres came to New Orleans shortly after Hurricane Katrina and helped rebuild the city. According to the Congress of Day Laborers, Torres is the first immigrant to seek sanctuary in a church in the Deep South since the election of President Trump. The Trump administration will allow American trophy hunters to import the bodies of elephants they kill in Zimbabwe and Zambia, reversing a ban put in place by President Obama. The Interior Department's rule change comes even though African elephants are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The policy could affect President Trump's two adult sons, Eric and Donald Jr., who are longtime trophy hunters who've repeatedly posed for photos with dead animals they killed in Africa. A 2012 picture of Donald Trump Jr. in Zimbabwe shows him standing in front of the corpse of an African elephant, holding a knife in one hand and a severed tail in the other. And the longtime Philadelphia-based civil rights activist and professor John Raines has died at the age of 84. In 1971, he and a group of other activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole every document they found and then leaked many to the press, including details about FBI abuses and the then-secret counterintelligence program known as COINTELPRO to infiltrate, monitor, and disrupt social and political movements. The burglars' identities remained a secret until 2014, when Raines, his wife Bonnie, and others came forward to take credit for the action. He spoke to Democracy Now! In 2014.
The problem was J. Edgar Hoover was untouchable. He was a national icon. I mean, he had presidents who were afraid of him. The people that we had elected to oversee J. Edgar Hoover's FBI were either enamored of him or terrified of him. Nobody was holding him accountable. And that meant that somebody had to get objective evidence of what his FBI was doing. And that led us to the idea that Bill Avedon suggested to us. Let's break into an FBI office, get their files, and get what they're doing in their own handwriting.
John Raines died on Sunday at the age of 84. You can visit our website, democracynow.org, to see the full interview. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Mimi Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We're broadcasting live today from the UN Climate Summit here in Bonn, Germany. We begin today's show with Zimbabwe, where longtime leader Robert Mugabe remains under house arrest and is reportedly refusing to resign as president after Zimbabwe's military seized parliament, courts, government offices, and the main airport in the capital, Harare. The apparent coup came a week after President Mugabe ousted his vice president, Emerson Mnangagwa, who fled the country only to return Wednesday. The military says it has appointed him as interim president. Residents in Harare reported an uneasy calm today after Tuesday night's apparent military coup, which saw armored vehicles rumble through the streets with explosions and heavy gunfire reported in Harare's northern suburbs, where a number of government officials live. This is Major General S.B. Moyo speaking Wednesday morning on Zimbabwean state television after Mugabe's arrest.
And sound, and their security is guaranteed. We are only targeting criminals around him who are committing crimes that are causing social and economic suffering in the country in order to bring them to justice.
Robert Mugabe has held power since Zimbabwe declared independence from the United Kingdom 37 years ago. The 93-year-old leader was working to hand over power to his wife, 52-year-old Grace Mugabe. There are conflicting accounts about her location, with some reports suggesting she fled to Namibia, while others report she's under house arrest in Zimbabwe. Well, for more, we're joined by two guests. Here in Bonn, Germany, we're joined by Nemo Bassi, Nigerian environmental activist, director of the Health of Mother Earth Foundation. And in Oxford, in Britain, we're joined by Jocelyn Alexander. She's professor at Oxford University, author of The Unsettled Land, The Politics of Land and State-Making in Zimbabwe, 1893 to 2003. Well, Professor, we're going to take this right through to today, 2017. Can you explain what you understand is taking place in Zimbabwe right now?
Yeah, I can try, though there's a great deal of confusion still about what's happening. As far as I understand it, there's a process of negotiation that's going on amongst the main players, and including emissaries from SADC, that is the regional group, and from South Africa. So all sides are trying to reach some kind of agreement, and they've been negotiating, I understand, since yesterday and till late last night, and they're resuming again today to try to come to some kind of agreement. But of course the positions are to some extent irreconcilable, and there's some question about whether Mugabe will be willing to step down and under what conditions, and then of course what kind of a regime will take over in his place. So that's very much an ongoing set of negotiations, and I think the shape of it is not yet clear.
Well, Professor Alexander, can you tell us why you think that Mugabe took this step now of sacking his vice president 9 days ago?
Emmerson Mnangagwa is a formidable political actor, and I think Mugabe felt that he was impatient to take power, and he wasn't willing to tolerate the kind of maneuverings that Mnangagwa and maybe more so some of his allies were undertaking. And so he moved against him, much as he moved against his predecessor, Joyce Mujuru, who was kicked out of office a few years earlier under similar circumstances. So Mugabe has acted to prevent anyone from assuming any path to power while he's still in office.
Well, can you give us the history of all of these power centers in Zimbabwe? Right, you have Grace Mugabe, the wife, you have the new president, and what their relationship is, as well as the person you just talked about.
I think there are a great many centers of power in Zimbabwe, and it's a very complicated system to fully understand. A lot of the portrayal has seen this as a question of the military versus Mugabe, but the military is, of course, itself not united. Part of the military remains loyal to Mugabe. I think there was quite a difference in the tone and demands and context provided in the two statements that came on Monday and then on early Wednesday morning, first from Constantino Chiwenga, the chief of the defense forces, and then from Sibusiso Moyo, who was a major general in the military. They elaborated different kinds of complaints, and they justified their intervention in quite different ways, which may or may not indicate that there is a division even among those who would like to remove Mugabe. Chiwenga is obviously very closely allied to Emmerson Mnangagwa, who has a very powerful position within ZANU-PF, the political party. And to some extent, you can see Chiwenga's actions as trying to aid the ascent of a friendly part of ZANU-PF from his point of view. And he may harbor, of course, political ambitions as well. I think there's a different view from within the military that can be seen as a kind of professional objection to what they're seeing as abuses of the Zimbabwean state and abuses of the Zimbabwean economy in terms of corruption and patronage. So there are different agendas even within the military that haven't really come out into the light of day yet, and I think we may see that play out in the next few days. But the intensity of the negotiations at the moment are about how Mugabe might leave, and I think there are a number of key players involved in that process. Of course, they're also consulting members of the opposition movement. There are very many different parties who make up the opposition. The most significant is led by Morgan Tsvangirai, who in fact beat Mugabe in an election in 2008, but was not allowed to assume power. And he remains probably the leader of the most significant in electoral terms opposition party. But there are other smaller parties that are also part of these negotiations and making demands. They have different kinds of links to South Africa and other regional players. So it's a very complex picture, and I think it would be rash to jump to conclusions at this point about what the outcome is going to be.
We're also joined by Dr. Knox Chitiyo, Associate Fellow of the Africa Program at Chatham House, who is currently in South Africa but just returned from Zimbabwe as all of this was unfolding. Can you describe what the atmosphere was like and your thoughts right now on what's happening in neighboring Zimbabwe?
Thank you. Hello. Yes, I was in Harare yesterday. I was there for some days. Look, it was surprisingly restrained. There was obviously a public anxiety about what was happening, about what people were hearing and saying, because of course Harare has always been rumor central. There's always rumors going around and people communicate by social media. So there was a lot of false news that was going on, which raised public anxieties. But on the ground, certainly in Harare, we didn't see, because I was there also on family, to see family. We didn't see a massive presence of soldiers. Yes, there were soldiers at strategic locations, and certain roads, particularly those which gave access to State House, those had been cordoned off, and the airport and so on and so forth. But you didn't see hundreds and hundreds of soldiers milling around on the streets. We didn't see harassment of civilians. So, in some ways, it's been a very surprisingly restrained and almost polite military-guided transition. The other surprising thing is that there's been a tacit public acceptance. I would hesitate to use the word endorsement of what's going on, because clearly this is not a democratic transition in the normal sense of the word. But, people, when you talk to people around, Zimbabwe's economy has reached such a low point, and the levels of suffering and impoverishment and the issues are so broad that people are saying, in Shona, people have been saying, which means, if it has to be done this way, so be it. Let's get closure. People want closure on this, because the sense of ongoing chaos and so on and so forth. So people just want closure. They didn't necessarily want it to be handled through the military, but they want closure and the sense that we're into a new period where people the new government, there is likely to be some new government coming in, can engage on the economy. The priority for people at home, what people are saying is the economy, jobs, food, and a sense, of movement on the economy for whoever comes.
So,
well, Dr. Knox Chitiyo, you are in South Africa now. Can you hear us, Dr. Chitiyo?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes. So you were just in Zimbabwe. You're in South Africa now. And as we speak, South African ministers are meeting with people in Zimbabwe in an attempt to resolve this crisis. Can you tell us historically what the role of South Africa and Zimbabwe has been?
It's been a very close role. I mean, historically, and I don't want to delve too far into the history, Zimbabwe and South Africa have been both competitors and collaborators in the region. At points in, the history of the past 100 years, South Africa has always been the regional hegemon, acknowledged hegemon. But Zimbabwe, at times, has been one of, kind of the number two in the region. So it's a very close relationship, sometimes contested. But we saw, during the 2000s, South Africa played a very strong role in terms of mediating the dispute between ZANU-PF and the opposition. They were the guarantors, along with SADC, of the Government of National Unity and the GPA. And South Africa now is coming on board again because there's obvious anxiety within the region that, this needs to be a negotiated transfer. What nobody wants is for process of Mugabe's exit to become a very messy, potentially violent. I think nobody wants that, particularly within the region, particularly within Zimbabwe. So that's why we're seeing South Africa stepping in again. They had after the GNU, there was a certain level of Zimbabwe fatigue within the region and within South Africa, because of course South Africa has got its own issues going. But what's happening now is too important and too critical for South Africa and the region not to step in, because it has huge implications for South Africa and the region. There's millions of Zimbabweans here in South Africa and in the region, so it has a massive regional implication.
I want to bring Nemo Bassi into this conversation, not Zimbabwean, but from Nigeria, though this certainly involves the whole continent. Nemo, you're an environmental activist, but you're here in Bonn, Germany. You hear that there has been a coup in Zimbabwe, though the government is now trying to say it's not a coup, it's a correction. So your thoughts as a longtime African leader?
It's absolutely a coup. There's no difference between what is going on in Zimbabwe and what we normally see as coup. I lived in Nigeria over a period of 30 years of military rule, and there were changes by military coup, military officers overthrowing each other, and you could see the same kind of trademark, the same kind of things happening. The president, who is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, is in detention, in house arrest, and that is a coup. That doesn't happen in other conditions. But I think the military in Zimbabwe are being very careful in handling the situation, and this may help also in the resolution of what is going on. But we see that the military and the leading political party in Zimbabwe have been working hand in hand right from independence, right from 1980. So Mugabe is working with the military. They helped to prop him up. They helped him in 1980 when the opposition defeated him in 2008, when the opposition movement for democratic change actually defeated him in the presidential election. So the military has been there to prop him up. Now looks like the military thought maybe they may lose out in the end, and they decided to take him out in this way.
Mugabe wasn't always known, though, or recognized as a military dictator or a dictator at all, because, of course, he helped lead the fight against the British in colonial Rhodesia.
Right.
So could you tell us a little bit about the transition that occurred over these decades? That was in 1980, and now it's 2017.
Well, Mugabe stood out as a leader of the guerrilla movement in then Rhodesia against the minority government that was in power. And then, of course, nobody sees him as a military dictator because he was always a civilian, more or less. But he had the military machine behind him. And I think that is what really made the Zimbabwe situation different from what we see in other African countries. And so over the years, from when he took over as prime minister, became president, and got to the point where the trend for succession became so clear. After he'd been in power for so long, people were really, I think the Zimbabweans actually needed change, but they couldn't find the space through the ballot box, which is very unfortunate. And the military is now exploiting that gap. And I think the military is opportunistic. I'm hoping that people can take up what has gone on now and change the situation. I've seen a very good statement from civil society saying, well, the military has done this, but the democratic principle must be followed. The constitution must not be subverted. But, it's a very difficult balancing game, what is going on now.
Professor Jocelyn Alexander, would you agree with Nemo Bassi on this issue of a correction, as the military is trying to put it, or a coup?
I think by any definition it is a coup. It's very interesting that they're trying to tell a story about it in which it's something different. But it's not unlike, the so-called guardian coups in West Africa, where you have people coming in and saying the politicians have got a bit out of control, they're overly corrupt, they're overly abusive. We're just trying to fix the situation so that we could get back on the right track. But obviously it's unconstitutional. Obviously it's illegal. Obviously, it's not a democratic process. So I think, by any other name, it's a coup. So that's, I think it's important, though, that they're trying to portray it as something else. And I think that's actually one of the things which is going to constrain them. And I hope my colleague Knox Chitio is correct that we will avoid any kind of open conflict, and this will be resolved through negotiation. the pressure on them to do that is that the government that comes in needs to have some kind of legitimacy. So the only way it can do that is if there is a negotiated agreement. There's some kind of terms on which Mugabe will step down. That will allow for a government that's more inclusive and that is not run by the military. And in fact, I don't think the military has the stomach for any kind of direct government. They very much want to hand back over to politicians. But the complication here is that some of the military, at any rate, is very much on the side of a particular faction in the ruling party, led, of course, by Emerson Mnangagwa. Emerson Mnangagwa is a divisive figure. So he's not someone who's going to easily unite the party behind him. He's not someone who's going to easily unite all of the security forces behind him. And of course, this is a large military with various different branches that have different kinds of loyalties. So that's something which raises a real challenge. But I would very much like to back up what Dr. Chitillo was saying about the kind of public reaction, which is also fascinating because it has been entirely passive. There's been no one in the street. There's been no celebration, but there's been no objection. None of the party's youth leagues have come out. You know, there's been no expressions of joy or of anger over what's happening. There's this sense of everybody waiting. And I mean, I've heard from very many people that they're happy about the change. And I think there is this extraordinary sense of Zimbabwe having been stuck in this place for a very long time and unable to get out of it, really since since very markedly since the 2008 election, but even earlier than that, change was necessary and it was being blocked, and it was being blocked by Robert Mugabe. So the idea that might be something that shifts now has caused a kind of euphoria, I think, a kind of optimism about what might be possible. And I don't want to be, overly negative, but I think that there needs to be a lot of care in thinking about what direction Zimbabwe is going in now, what kind of deals are being made, how this government really is going to be held accountable, who it actually represents. What kind of stability we're talking about in the end. So all of those things, I think, remain to be resolved, or even really, I don't think we really know the shape of it yet.
And so we will certainly continue to cover this. We want to thank Oxford professor Jocelyn Alexander, speaking to us from Oxford, Dr. Knox Chitillo of Chatham House, Zimbabwe, and just left Zimbabwe, speaking to us from Johannesburg, and Nemo Bassi, Health of Mother Earth Foundation. But Nemo, before you go, we wanted to touch on a few issues. And I don't know if you can talk about this, but it's an issue that the Trump administration has been dealing with around Zimbabwe. The Trump administration has reversed an Obama-era rule, allowing American trophy hunters to import the bodies of elephants they kill in Zimbabwe and Zambia. The Interior Department's rule change comes even though African elephants are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The policy would affect President Trump's both adult sons, Eric and Donald Jr., who are longtime trophy hunters who've repeatedly posed for photos with dead animals in Africa. A 2012 picture of Donald Trump Jr. in Zimbabwe shows him standing in front of the corpse of an African elephant, holding a knife in one hand and a severed tail in another. As an environmental activist on the continent, your thoughts?
Well, also from the political level, I think I can't imagine what else will come out of the White House, the United States, that will horrify us any more than what we've seen already. But this is actually a very low point. To have the President of the United States reverse such a ban. The wildlife in Africa has been decimated by trophy hunters. And right now, we also have the problems of local people being targeted in the process of protecting wildlife in reservations and in game parks. But to allow trophy hunters from the United States to kill, destroy, decimate animals and wildlife in Africa and take the bodies to the U.S. or to anywhere else is totally reprehensible. It's horrible and should be condemned.
You said you didn't think anything else could horrify you about what the U.S. is doing right now. You've been at COP for many years. This is the first UN climate summit in which the U.S., well, the new president, Donald Trump, has said he's pulling the U.S. out of the UN Climate Summit. Your response to this, the significance of this, and what it means for Africa?
You know, when the announcement came, my first reaction was, well, the U.S. has never really been a positive force in the Conference of Parties on climate change. The U.S. has consistently, right from Kyoto in 1997, they introduced market forces. In 2009, in Copenhagen, the U.S. brought the Copenhagen Accord, driving the discussion from having binding regimes to voluntary regime, which is what we ended up having in Paris and what is being negotiated now. So when Trump pulled out, my fear was that the pulling off wasn't taking immediate effect, but rather would take a couple of years before it happens. So within that time, the U.S. would do more harm than they would have done if they had just left immediately. Trump said, we are leaving. And so this is a big problem for the world, because it means that the problems that nations in Africa, in vulnerable small island states are facing from storms, hurricanes, and typhoons, they're going to face more, and that there's no hope that a rich, polluting nation like the U.S. would do its own fair share to help mitigate these problems.
And Nigeria, the largest oil-producing country in Africa, how climate change affects your nation, the most populous nation in Africa?
Oh, yes. We're having real serious impacts, and we've been discussing with the government on this, and that Nigeria needs to take action, not just depending on what others may help them to do. For example, the northern part of Nigeria is highly impacted by increasing desertification. Nigeria is close to the Sahara Desert. But we're having 11 states in northern Nigeria being impacted by desertification. In the south, we have a sea level rise combined with heavy pollution from the oil industry. And so you're having people being displaced from the south and displaced from the north. When you hear about violence in the northeast, like the Boko Haram violence, a lot of the conflict that we're having between herdsmen and farmers is caused by climate impacts.
Why do you say climate impacts? Boko Haram, people would be very shocked. The group that's captured hundreds of girls.
Oh, yeah, they did that. They've done horrible things. They're still using little girls as suicide bombers, which is horrible. And, I mean, whatever they've done cannot be defended. But what gives them the army that they're working with? Is the climate impact that is dispossessing the people. Lake Chad was once 25,000 square kilometers. Now it is 1,500 square kilometers. And so a lot of people, the fisher folks, the farmers, the pastoralists are being displaced looking for grazing land, because we don't have ranches like they have in the U.S. We have free-range cattle. And so they're moving southwards and having conflict with farmers. Really, the middle part of the country, there's a lot of bloodshed due to this kind of conflict, and clearly traceable to global warming.
Well, we want to thank you, Nima Bassi, for joining us today and for being here, I think, probably longer than we have been at all the UN climate summits back to Copenhagen. I'm used to seeing you getting arrested here at some protest.
Well, now, today we are free.
Nima Bassi, Nigerian environmental activist, director of the Health of Mother Earth Foundation, wrote the foreword for the report by Corporate Accountability titled Polluting Paris, How Big Polluters Are Undermining Global Climate Policy. We're going to talk about that report in just a minute. He's also author of the book, To Cook a Continent. Stay with us. Mozambique by the Zimbabwean musician Thomas Mapfumo. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting live from the UN Climate Summit. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Well, representatives from nearly 200 nations have gathered here in Bonn, Germany. But they're not the only ones flocking to the city for this year's UN Climate Summit. A number of fossil fuel companies and corporate sponsors have also descended on Bonn, where they're pushing their own agenda behind the scenes. On Tuesday, activists disrupted a presentation at an annual corporate conference held alongside the climate summit here in Bonn. The activists were protesting the European Investment Bank for funding the construction of the Trans-Adriatic gas pipeline known as TAP.
The EIB is funding climate chaos.
Is funding climate chaos.
The EIB is funding fossil fuels.
Is funding fossil fuels.
Is it Amy or me?
The Trans-Adriatic gas pipeline is slated to run from the Greek-Turkish border through Greece and Albania under the Adriatic Sea into Italy. A new report by Corporate Europe Observatory reveals how the gas industry spent more than 100 million euros and deployed over 1,000 lobbyists to push gas as an energy solution to lawmakers in Brussels and across the European Union in 2016. For more, we're joined by two guests here in the heart of the UN Climate Summit. Pasco Sabido is a researcher and campaigner for Corporate Europe Observatory, and Jesse Bragg is Media Director for Corporate Accountability. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Pasco, let's begin with you. What should people in the United States and around the world understand about what you feel are the most critical issues now to deal with at this climate summit?
I think what we're seeing here is a lot of focus happening on coal. And I think it's really important. Coal is damaging to the climate. That's completely agreed, despite what the US might be saying. I'm sure Jesse could comment on that later. But unfortunately, whilst there's a lot of talk about coal phase-outs, everyone's moving into gas. And gas has been seen as a clean solution. But in fact, if you look at the entire production cycle, when you drill for gas, when you transport it, it releases huge amounts of methane. And methane is more than 100 times worse for the climate than CO2. So in fact, coal and gas are pretty equal when it comes to climate impacts. But yet, all of these coal companies, oil companies, gas companies are trying to move us into yet another fossil fuel, getting a huge amount of political support. That's seeing new pipelines, new LNG terminals, really locking us into another 40 to 50 years. So we need to be really aware that when we talk about moving out of coal, we need to phase out of all fossil fuels. And that's seen by the sponsors. You know, we have BNP Paribas, who's sponsoring the talks. They're one of the big gas funders of pipelines, LNG terminals. I mean, they've recently said they're not going to finance fracking, but they're still financing gas. And Iberdrola, another big fossil fuel company, who's also put its money into gas. So we're really seeing something very dangerous that's going under the radar because of the spin by the gas industry telling us it's clean.
Well, Pasco, could you tell us about the EU's lead negotiator here in the talks, Miguel Arias Cañete? He himself was involved in some gas companies before he took on this position?
So whilst he was a member of the Spanish Parliament, he was actually the president of not one but two oil companies in the Canary Islands. And then he was made a Minister for Environment. Since then, whilst Minister for Environment, he approved fracking in Spain. He approved oil drilling in a UNESCO heritage site off the Canary Islands. He also saw the first shipment of tar sands arrive from Canada to Spain. I mean, this is a guy who's not particularly pro-climate, you would say, and then he's made the climate commissioner. So we have a huge conflict of interest.
Who appoints the climate commissioner here for the EU?
So exactly. So he's the head of the EU delegation, and that's appointed by the president of the European Commission. So it's actually proposed by Spain. He comes from the Spain ruling party, the Partido Popular, and then he's appointed by Juncker. But that has to go before an audition in front of the Parliament. And despite all of these conflicts of interest, he was still allowed to become a commissioner.
Very quickly, the TAP pipeline. Explain what it is, where it goes.
Yeah, so this is a pipeline coming from Turkish-Greek border to Italy, and it's being fought the entire way. It's supposed to bring Azerbaijani gas to Europe. It's well over budget. Communities along the pipeline are being moved out. The military has even moved into southern Italy to lock down the local villages and stop them trying to protest. They're not being allowed in or out, all so that this construction can happen with the big gas companies. And this is all about locking Europe into yet more gas. But Azerbaijan is, I mean, to say the least, a corrupt dictatorship, locking up political opponents. Anyone who's come out against this pipeline is finding themselves in prison. So this is not the sort of thing the EU, who claims to be a climate leader, needs to be supporting, and definitely not the sort of thing that European Investment Bank and other European banks should be funding.
I want to ask Jesse Bragg, about what's happening now with Ukraine. I've heard this question a lot at the UN Climate Summit, but what is the U.S. connection with Ukraine and coal right now?
Well, so about a few months ago, the U.S. Energy Secretary Rick Perry went over to Ukraine and struck a deal. I believe it's $80 million of U.S. coal to be imported to Ukraine. As part of that negotiation, there was also a deal around nuclear fuel, giving Westinghouse a real windfall of shipping nuclear fuel to Ukraine. So that's, generally speaking, the context under which Ukraine is operating here at the talks.
And explain what Ukraine is proposing when it comes to the Paris climate deal.
So details are still sketchy, but it's called Committee for Future. And the idea behind this, based on a report by Climate Home, is that corporations would be seated at the table to make decisions and sort of oversee the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And we're talking not just general corporations, energy corporations and fossil fuel corporations. So it really flips on its head the construct that is the UN, where governments make rules and enforce them on corporations, and allows corporations to oversee governments in the implementation of the Paris Agreement.
Did they propose this after the former Texas governor, now Energy Secretary Perry, went to Ukraine?
That's right.
Because the U.S. is pulling out of the climate deal,
right.
So we need someone else to do this.
Exactly. They don't have much political capital, rightfully so, in this space. And so one has to wonder if this was part of that deal that was struck. You will import coal to you, and in return, you can float this proposal that will give our corporations a concerted seat at the table.
Well, Pascal Zabido, could you say a little about the report that you have on gas? I mean, you just made the point that Europe, the TAP pipeline, is keeping Europe gas dependent. Now, of course, the perception in the U.S. is that the EU and European countries more generally are much more sympathetic to the fact, and accept the fact of climate change, and are taking massive steps to deal with it. But what you're saying is that, given that this oil company executive is the EU's lead negotiator, that perception might not be entirely accurate.
Unfortunately not. No, what we're seeing in Brussels is TAP is just one of many such pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructures being built. But the EU is still managing to have this image of being pro-climate because gas is being spun as a clean fossil fuel, which is completely not true. So what we're seeing is, in Brussels, the gas industry is involved in policymaking at every single level. From the very, very beginning, all the way through Parliament, through to the end, to when actual policy, the fine details are worked out. But this is not just the gas industry power, which is considerable. This is also the open arms of the European Commission and governments. They're being welcomed in. In the EU, we're basing our entire climate policy on projections for future gas use. Who's giving us these projections? The gas industry. And then the European Commission has gone and asked the gas industry to write out a list of projects that will correspond to these needs. So inflated gas demand, give us some projects. They've given a huge list, which includes pipelines and terminals and all sorts.
Rex Tillerson, former head of the largest oil corporation in the world, ExxonMobil, now Secretary of State. Do you see his fingerprints here? He was just actually in Burma with Aung San Suu Kyi, apparently talking about the Rohingya.
Yeah, the U.S. fossil fuel industry's fingerprints are all over this agreement, and certainly all over what the U.S. is doing here. We've seen them block really important negotiations on things like pre-2020 action or loss and damage finance, the things that will help developing countries.
Loss and damage means, this is all lingo.
To support rebuilding after catastrophic climate events. These are all components that would help lead to liability, admitting the liability of the fossil fuel industry, for example. And so in the U.S.'s positions, they're all just to protect, it seems, the fossil fuel industry.
We just have another minute to go, but Pasco on Monday night was quite a scene. You had the U.S. delegation, whatever they constitute themselves as, the representative of Trump, of Pence, and 4 corporate executives from the oil, gas, and nuclear industry in a room. You had hundreds of people inside and outside the room. They interrupted with song, Proud to be an American, and changed the lyrics against the fossil fuel industry, and then walked out. But here was the U.S. showcasing, not even including renewables, but only oil, gas, and nuclear. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this really underlines why it's so important to kick them out. I mean, we need to kick them out not just these UN talks, but out of national level government. We need to introduce a measure that can protect our policymakers from their vested interests. Because as long as these fossil fuel companies have a grip over policymaking, we're never going to reach the Paris Agreement and not go further than it, which is what we need to do to keep temperature rises below 1.5 degrees.
Next year, this is in Poland.
Coal country. Yeah.
And it just was in Poland a few years ago. Why does Poland get it twice, and what does that mean around the issue of coal?
This really means that coal is going to be high on the agenda, that proposals such as Ukraine are going to come back more and more, and that it means the fight against coal, against gas, against oil are going to have to be doubled down. We really need to make sure that these industries are kept as far away from our governments and our policymakers as possible.
Well, we want to thank you both for being with us. Pasco Savido, Corporate Europe Observatory, and Jesse Bragg, Corporate Accountability. Those are their groups. We'll link to their reports. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, what are climate refugees, climate migrants? Stay with us.
يا مسافر وحدك يا مسافر وحدك وفايتني لتبعد عني لتبعد عني وتشغلني ودعني من غير ما يسلم وكفاية قلبي أنا مسلم
Music by Musicana here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh, and we are broadcasting live from the UN Climate Summit in Bonn.
This year is known as the first Islands COP, with Fiji presiding over this year's summit. The event itself is being held here in Bonn because of the logistical challenges of hosting thousands of people in Fiji at the start of the South Pacific cyclone season. Researchers here at Bonn are warning that Pacific Islanders may be among the first to be forced to migrate due to climate change, as sea level rise is threatening to make whole islands uninhabitable.
Well, on Wednesday, we got a chance to speak with Pacific Islanders who rolled out a red carpet to greet German Chancellor Angela Merkel here at the COP23. The massive banner that went along the floor to the plenary read, "Keep it in the ground." Among those who rolled it out were Pacific warriors. Lucia Ferranda, a delegate from the Marshall Islands. I asked them how climate change is affecting their islands.
In the Pacific, with the sea levels rising, a lot of our lower-lying atoll countries are being affected. I mean, Marshall Islands is 2 meters above sea level. Tuvalu probably 3. And once king tides come in, it's most likely that their villages will be flooded with salt water because of the rising sea levels. Even in Samoa, places where families, their ancestral homes used to be on the shore, now have to be moved further inland because of the rising sea level. So it's affecting way of life, it's affecting crops and indigenous root crops because of saltwater intrusion, as well as fresh drinking supplies as well.
But island nations are not the only places where climate change is threatening to force people from their homes. Last year, around the world, at least 23 million people were displaced by extreme weather. For more, we're joined by Dina Ionesco, the head of Migration, Environment, and Climate Change at the International Organization for Migration. So you just heard people from Tonga and Marshall Islands. What do they face? What is a climate change migrant or climate change refugee?
Well, climate change migration means that the impacts of climate change affect so much the lives of people that they can't stay in their homes. And very often also climate change connects to other issues, poverty, for instance, or demographic issues or conflict, and it makes it even more difficult for people to remain. So climate migration means that people have to move, but also sometimes choose to move because their environment is degrading. And it can mean, as you said, sudden onset, big storms, floods. There it's easier to count who moved because of those causes. But it means also this slow onset, like desertification, sea level rise, land loss. So it's very complex, many different issues, but the bottom line is that we maybe do not want these people to be forced to move because of climate change. So this is why we are here.
Well, a few years ago, a man from the island of Kiribati sparked a global debate because he became the first person ever to seek asylum for him and his family as climate refugees. So could you tell us about his case and what's happened with people seeking asylum for climate-related issues?
So we have to realize that the majority of people who move because of climate change, they move internally. They move within borders. So that means they are under the responsibility of their own states. They are not seeking climate refugee status because their own state has to take care of them and respect their human rights. There are some cases, we had the case for these small islands or for Haiti after the earthquake, where people moved across borders, maybe to Brazil or to the US or just across within the same island. And then there's the question, what right do they have to move to stay? And there are also possibilities to give them a humanitarian visa or a temporary protection that can allow them to stay. You can't be a refugee for the moment. Maybe it will be, but we don't know that. It's very difficult to create a status as a refugee for climate change.
We only have 45 seconds, and we're going to do part 2 and post it online. But what do you think it's most important for the world to know right now about what the world is doing about climate migrants?
I think one key thing to realize is that if we act now in terms of climate change action, if we take care of the Earth now, it means we support for people to stay in their homes, that they are not forced to migrate. So that's one key message we have to say. Invest in climate action. It gives people a choice whether to go. They have the right to move if they want to move. But let's not make migration a last resort, a tragedy, when it's too late, when there's nothing else.
Well, Dina Ionesco, we thank you so much. We're going to do part 2 and post online as a web exclusive at democracynow.org, head of migration, environment, and climate change at the International Organization for Migration. I'll be speaking in Berlin on Saturday night at 7:30 at the Festhalle Kreuzberg. Check our website. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Carla Wills, Laura Guy, Diener, Sam Malkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.